Princess Elara stood on the balcony of the imperial palace, her eyes staring out at the vast expanse of the Valari capital, the night sky filled with stars that seemed so distant and cold. As if mocking her situation beneath her, the city buzzed with activity, the sounds of hovercrafts, and busy crowds, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside her heart. The message she had just received from her father, the Emperor, rang in her mind, his voice unyielding in its command, announcing her arranged marriage to a human diplomat. Marcus, his name, felt like a foreign curse to her. She had spent her entire life believing that the Valari were the pinnacle of evolution, the superior species in the galaxy above all others. And yet here she stood facing an unimaginable humiliation, a political maneuver forced upon her as part of a treaty with the humans, a treaty she knew little about. But she knew enough to despise the thought of it. She had been raised with the belief that humans were crude, primitive, and inferior beings, capable only of destruction and chaos. Nothing about Marcus could inspire any respect in her, let alone admiration. And yet here she was about to become his bride. Her father's words echoed in her mind again and again. The alliance with humanity is essential to the survival of the Empire. We must secure this bond, Elara. You must do this. For the Valari people, her duty had always come first. But this was different. This felt like betrayal, not only to herself, but to her ancestors who had fought so hard to establish the Valari as rulers of the galaxy. Now she was expected to marry one of those creatures and bear his name. She clenched her fists at her sides, her fingers digging into the smooth stone of the balcony railing. She hated how powerless she felt, how her own family had treated her like a pawn to secure peace, how they had disregarded her thoughts, feelings, and desires, as if they meant nothing. She had always done what was expected of her, always followed the path laid out before her, always acted with the utmost duty and loyalty to her people. But now that path felt like a cage, a gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. Elara turned from the balcony to face the ornate chambers of her palace, her reflection caught in the mirrored walls, revealing her regal features, her golden skin glistening under the soft light, her eyes a striking shade of violet. They were the eyes of an empress. But they were filled with something new, something unfamiliar, frustration and fear of what this marriage would mean for her future, for the Empire, and for her own heart. What if Marcus was everything she feared? What if he was weak and fragile? What if she had to endure a life of tolerating his presence as she fought to maintain her dignity? She took a deep breath and turned back to the balcony, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't answer. What kind of man was Marcus? Was he truly as beneath her as she had been taught? Would he try to control her? Or would he prove to be as insignificant as she had imagined? Did he even want this marriage, or was he simply following his own duty like she was? The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sounds of celebration, marking the beginning of her fate, a fate she could not escape, no matter how much she fought against it, no matter how hard she tried to shut her mind off from the truth. She had no choice. The marriage would happen, and she would have to face it with a smile, even if it tore her apart inside. The day of the ceremony arrived with a sense of inevitability that gnawed at Elara's insides. She stood before the grand mirror in her chamber, the intricate gown of gold and violet clinging to her figure, the delicate fabrics shimmering in the light. Her face was a mask of composure, but her heart thudded wildly against her chest. She had spent years preparing for this moment, not as the bride of a human, but as a symbol of the Valari Empire. Her marriage would represent the unity of two great civilizations. But as she stared at her reflection, she could not shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. Her attendants moved around her with practiced efficiency, adjusting the gown, fixing her hair, preparing her for the moment when she would walk down the aisle toward Marcus, toward the life she never wanted. They spoke in hushed tones, but none of their words could penetrate the silence in her mind. They were focused on their tasks, as if they were preparing her for an ordinary wedding, as if this were anything but a political transaction. Outside the chamber, Elara could hear the murmurs of the guests gathering for the ceremony, the hum of anticipation filling the air. The corridors were alive with the voices of the Empire's elite from every corner of the galaxy, all of them eager to witness the union between the Valari and humans, a union she had been forced into but could not escape. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and the chief advisor entered with a bow. His face was respectful, but his eyes betrayed the curiosity that everyone else felt about this unusual match. "Princess Ilara, the ceremony will begin soon," he said, his voice gentle as if attempting to comfort her. But his words only deepened the tension that already thrummed in her chest. She nodded stiffly, unable to respond, her mind too clouded by the swirling chaos inside. As she made her way to the grand hall, the weight of her duty pressed down on her with every step. The air was thick with expectation. As she entered the room, the guests fell silent. All eyes turned to her, their gazes filled with reverence and curiosity. She could almost feel their judgment, their whispers about her choice, and about the human standing at the altar. Marcus was there waiting for her, his posture straight, his dark hair neatly styled, his eyes meeting hers with a calmness that made her seethe with frustration. When their eyes locked, Ilara felt an inexplicable shift in the air. It was subtle but undeniable. Something in Marcus's gaze made her pause, made her feel like she was seeing him for the first time. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in it, something she had not expected from a human, and certainly not from the one she had been taught to disdain. He didn't bow or show any sign of fear in her presence. Instead, he simply stood there waiting for her to join him. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her down the aisle toward him, her body betraying her mind. She could not allow herself to feel anything but duty, yet with every step closer to Marcus, something inside her stirred. It was as though his presence was magnetic, drawing her in, despite her will to resist. When she reached the altar, and the officiant began the ceremony, her breath caught in her throat. When his hand brushed hers, the touch was fleeting, but it sparked a jolt of warmth through her skin, a feeling she could not explain. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Her heart raced, her mind screamed at her to pull away, to stay in control, but she could not. It was too late. The touch had ignited something in her, something she couldn't understand. And as she stood there in front of him, she realized she might have underestimated the man before her in ways she never thought possible. The night following the ceremony, Ilara sat alone in her chambers, the silence in the room oppressive, her mind still racing from the events of the day. She could feel the weight of the crown upon her even more now than she ever had before. The decision to marry Marcus was not her own, but it was one she would have to live with the rest of her life. And the thought of that made her sick to her stomach. She had done her duty. She had stood before the Empire and pledged herself to this human diplomat, and yet something inside her twisted at the thought of the marriage becoming real. Something inside her screamed that it wasn't right. The touch that had sparked between her and Marcus lingered in her mind, her hand still faintly tingling where his had brushed hers. A sensation was unlike anything she had ever felt before. The feeling was warm and electric, as though his touch had awakened something dormant inside her, and the idea of that made her want to tear her skin off, to escape the unsettling feeling it had left behind. She had spent her life teaching herself to control everything, her emotions, her reactions, her desires. But now her body betrayed her, and that frightened her more than she was willing to admit. The door to her chambers opened without a sound, and Ilara turned to see Marcus standing in the doorway, his posture respectful, but his expression unreadable. She could feel his presence in the room, as if his energy was pulling at hers. He was not here as a husband, not yet, but he was here because he had been assigned to her to share a life she did not want. He looked different, now more real than the distant figure she had imagined him to be. Throughout the day, she had kept her distance from him, never allowing herself to look at him for too long. But now here he was standing before her, and for the first time Ilara was forced to confront him, not as an outsider but as her husband. Marcus spoke her name softly, his voice carrying across the distance between them. Ilara, a single word that seemed to reach deeper into her than anything he had said before. There was something in his tone, something that softened the hardness she had wrapped herself in all these years. And for the briefest moment she felt herself falter. She had been trained to be strong, to be cold, to show no weakness. But here he was pulling something from her, something she couldn't control. "I thought we should speak," he said, his voice steady, but laced with an edge of uncertainty. "You've been through a lot today, and I know this isn't what either of us expected, but I want you to know I will give you all the space you need. I don't want to pressure you into anything, not now." His words were gentle and respectful, and yet they made Ilara feel something she couldn't name, something like warmth creeping beneath the layers of ice she had built around herself. His patience was maddening. She had expected him to demand her attention, to take control of the situation, as so many men in her life had. But Marcus didn't approach her like that. He was standing there waiting for her to lead the way, and that unnerved her. She remained silent for a long moment, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to feel about his kindness, about his quiet acceptance. She had expected to feel nothing for him, but instead she felt a stir inside her, a strange pull that she couldn't understand. She stood from her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, doing what he met her gaze without hesitation. "Why are you being so patient with me when I've given you nothing but coldness? Why aren't you angry with me?" Marcus tilted his head, his expression softening. "I don't expect anything from you, Ilara. I'm not angry with you," he said. "I just want you to feel comfortable. I want you to trust me when you're ready." Her breath caught at his words, and for the first time she found herself speechless, unsure of how to respond. She wanted to push him away, to tell him that his kindness meant nothing to her, that she would never trust him. But his quiet sincerity disarmed her in ways she couldn't explain. The tension in the room was thick now. Neither of them knew what to do or say next, and yet Ilara could feel the space between them closing in a way that made her heart beat faster than she was comfortable with. She turned away quickly, walking to the far side of the room, her hands shaking at her sides. "I don't know what to do with this," she muttered, not even sure if he could hear her. "I don't either," Marcus replied, his voice calm and steady. But there was a hint of something else there, something that made her pause, something that made her want to turn around and face him. But she didn't. Instead, she kept her back to him, feeling the weight of his presence behind her, and the strange pull between them growing stronger with every passing second. Days passed, and Ilara found herself tangled in confusion. She couldn't deny that something had shifted between her and Marcus. A space between them grew less cold, though she never allowed herself to admit it aloud. Whenever their eyes met, there was a quiet understanding, a flicker of something that made her heart race and her thoughts scatter. It wasn't the attraction she had been taught to fear. It was something deeper, something unsettling. The touch they had shared during the ceremony had only been the beginning, and now every accidental brush of his hand, every shared glance, sent shockwaves through her body in ways she couldn't control. At night, she would lie awake in bed, her mind replaying their interactions from the day, what he had said, how he had looked at her, his patience, his warmth, how it made her feel as though she was a fragile thing capable of shattering if she wasn't careful, and she hated how vulnerable he made her feel, how his presence unnerved her more than any battle she had ever fought. She had always believed in control, in the power of her own will to shape the world around her, but with Marcus nothing seemed to follow the rules. Everything about him defied her expectations, and it made her furious with herself for not being able to control it. She was the princess of the Valari Empire. She had been trained to lead, to command, to never falter in the face of adversity, and yet here she was trapped by a human who had the power to break her without even trying. Ilara stood before the window in her chambers once again, gazing out at the city below. The sun had just set, and the night sky stretched out before her like an endless sea of stars. She wondered if the humans even knew how to navigate such vastness, or if they simply wandered through it in search of something. She had heard the stories of human explorers, of their curiosity, their hunger for knowledge, but she had never seen any evidence of that herself until now. She turned sharply when she heard the door open softly. Marcus entered without hesitation, his eyes immediately finding hers, his gaze warm but careful. There was no pressure in his presence, just a quiet understanding that she wasn't ready to speak yet, but that he would wait as long as it took for her to trust him. Ilara crossed her arms over her chest and turned back to the window, avoiding his gaze. "I'm not ready to talk," she said, her voice flat, her emotions roiling beneath the surface. But she didn't want him to know that she was afraid of what he might say, afraid of what he might make her feel. Marcus took a step closer, but didn't approach too quickly. His movements were measured and deliberate, as if he was trying to give her the space she needed. "I'm not asking you to talk, Ilara," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just be honest with yourself, that's all I want from you." His words pierced through her defenses, And for the first time she wondered if she had been fooling herself. All along she had spent so much time pretending to be indifferent to him, pretending that he was just a tool to be used for political gain. But his words cut through that armor with such ease that she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to face him, finally allowing herself to meet his eyes. The raw honesty in his gaze sent a shock of recognition through her, and for a moment she saw him not as a human, not as a political ally, but as something more, something that made her heart race and her breath catch. "Do you feel it too?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible, but the sincerity in it was undeniable. Ilara didn't answer at first. She couldn't bring herself to speak the truth aloud, the truth that terrified her more than anything else she had ever faced. Yes, she felt it too. She felt everything, his presence, his touch, his voice, all of it rippling through her in ways she had never experienced before. It wasn't just the connection of two people bound by duty. It was something deeper, something that had awakened inside her, a force she couldn't name, but knew was powerful enough to change everything. And for the first time since the ceremony, Ilara didn't push him away. She didn't turn from him or hide from the storm of emotions rising inside her. Instead, she stood there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. But for once, she allowed herself to feel what was happening between them without trying to control it. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty as the cracks in Ilara's carefully constructed walls continued to widen. Each interaction with Marcus left her both unsettled and intrigued. She tried to remain distant, but it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the growing connection between them. There were moments when their gazes would meet, and a strange energy seemed to pulse between them, a kind of silent understanding that neither could deny, no matter how hard they tried to keep their distance. Ilara spent her time in meetings with advisors and military leaders of the Empire, all of them looking to her for guidance, all of them unaware of the turmoil that churned inside her every time Marcus's name was mentioned. She tried to focus on her duties, on the future of the Valari people, but her mind kept drifting back to him, to the warmth of his touch, to the way he seemed to see through her cold exterior, as if he knew exactly what she was trying to hide. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting, Ilara found herself walking through the palace gardens. Alone, the air was crisp and cool. As she wandered among the trees, a scent of flowers drifting in the breeze, the moonlight cast soft shadows on the path ahead. And for the first time in what felt like weeks, she allowed herself a moment of peace away from the pressure of her responsibilities. It was then that she heard a voice behind her, Ilara. She turned quickly to see Marcus standing a few paces away, his posture relaxed, but his expression serious, his dark eyes fixed on her with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. "What are you doing here?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "I was looking for you," he said, his voice steady, but laced with something else, a hint of concern, maybe even longing. "But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I wanted to check on you after the meeting. You've been under a lot of pressure lately." Ilara didn't respond at first, her mind racing. She was used to being alone, to handling everything herself. But now, with Marcus standing in front of her, it was different. She could feel his presence like a weight in the air, and it made her uneasy. It wasn't just the political alliance that bound them, it was something else, something she couldn't quite explain. "You don't need to worry about me," she said finally, her voice colder than she intended. "I can handle things." "I'm not here to take your burden from you," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm just here to help if you'll let me." Ilara's chest tightened at his words. She had never been good at accepting help, especially from someone who wasn't part of her worlds, someone who didn't understand the weight of her responsibilities. But there was something about the sincerity in his voice that made her hesitate. Maybe it was the way he seemed to care for her in ways she couldn't fathom. Maybe it was the fact that despite everything she had tried to push him away, he hadn't gone anywhere. "I don't need anyone," she said more harshly than she meant. But Marcus didn't flinch, he didn't back away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know you don't, but I'm still here," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'll be here for as long as you need me, even if you don't ask for it." For a moment, Ilara was silent, caught in the strange pull of his words. She wanted to reject them, wanted to tell him to leave her alone, to stop being so kind to her. But there was something inside her, something she didn't understand, that made it impossible to push him away. and before she could stop herself, she found herself stepping toward him. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she thought to herself as she closed the distance between them. She wasn't supposed to feel anything for him, she wasn't supposed to care. But as she stood there inches away from Marcus, she realized she did care in a way that terrified her. His hand reached out hesitantly, but before it could touch her arm, Elara stopped him, her eyes locking onto his face. "What is this?" She whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely audible, but the uncertainty in it mirrored her own confusion. "All I know is that whatever this is, it's real, and I don't want to run from it anymore." Ilara's heart raced in her chest as she stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She didn't know what to make of them, but she knew one thing for certain: the longer she stood here with him, the harder it would be to turn away, and that thought terrified her more than anything else. The days after that moment were a blur of conflicting emotions. Ilara could no longer deny the bond that had begun to form between her and Marcus. Every time they spoke, every time their paths crossed, there was an undeniable pull between them, something deeper than mere duty, something neither of them could control no matter how hard they tried to fight it. The more time she spent with him, the more she felt herself unraveling in ways she hadn't expected. She had been taught to control her emotions, to keep everything locked away beneath the surface, but Marcus made her question everything. She couldn't understand why she felt this way, why his presence seemed to disrupt everything she had built up over the years, why his words felt like a lifeline and a threat at the same time. It was as though his very existence challenged everything she had believed about herself and about the world around her. He was a human, he was supposed to be inferior to her, and yet here he was standing beside her, not bowing to her, not deferring to her status, but treating her as an equal, and that unsettled her more than anything else. One evening, after a long day of meetings and tense discussions, Ilara found herself walking alone in the garden again. The air was thick, with the scent of blooming flowers, sounds of distant chatter from the palace floating in the background. But for once she didn't feel the weight of the empire pressing down on her. For once she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to think about the strange feelings that had taken root inside her. As she walked, she heard a soft rustling behind her, and before she could turn around, Marcus appeared from the shadows, his presence quiet but unmistakable. Ilara stopped in her tracks, unsure of what to say or do. He had been patient with her so far, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pushing him away, or if she even wanted to. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice gentle, but with a hint of concern, his eyes searching hers, as though looking for something she wasn't ready to give. "I'm not avoiding you," she replied, though the words felt like a lie. She had been doing everything in her power to keep her distance from him, to pretend that nothing had changed, but it had changed, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She could feel the tension between them thick in the air. The space that had once been filled with cold indifference now felt charged with something she couldn't define. "Then why do you look at me like that?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice low but steady. Ilara turned away from him, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't want to confront this, not yet. She wasn't ready to admit what she felt or why it terrified her so much. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though saying the words aloud would make them real. Marcus reached out, gently placing his hand on her arm, his touch warm and steady. It sent a shiver down her spine, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't bring herself to do it. "I think you do," he said softly, his voice like a caress. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, and I think you're scared." Ilara closed her eyes at his words, a wave of emotion crashing over her that she couldn't control. She hated how vulnerable he made her feel, how his presence seemed to strip away all of her defenses and expose her to herself in ways she had never experienced before. She was supposed to be strong, she was supposed to be in control, but in that moment, she felt like she was losing herself to him, and that terrified her more than anything else. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you still here? Why don't you leave me alone?" Marcus's grip on her arm tightened slightly, not in a way that was forceful, but in a way that was reassuring, like he was grounding her to the moment, like he wasn't going anywhere. "Because I'm not going anywhere," he said simply, "because I care about you, and I know this isn't easy for you, but I'm here for you, Ilara, and I always will be." Her heart raced in her chest at his words, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to look at him fully, to see the sincerity in his eyes, to hear the truth in his voice, and for a brief moment, she felt something inside her stir, something that had been buried for so long, something she didn't want to acknowledge, but couldn't ignore any longer. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with emotions neither of them knew how to handle. But as Marcus stood there before her, his eyes locked on hers, Elara realized something she had been trying so hard to deny. She couldn't fight this anymore. She couldn't push him away, not when everything inside her was telling her to let him in, not when the warmth of his touch felt like the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat, and for a moment neither of them spoke, just stood there in the quiet of the garden, with nothing but the sound of their breathing and the weight of their shared silence wrapping around them like a promise neither was ready to break. The next few days passed in a blur for Elara. She could feel the change between her and Marcus, growing with every interaction. The quiet moments they shared became more frequent and more meaningful. But each time she allowed herself to grow closer to him, she also felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest, fear of what this connection meant, fear of what it could cost her. Her duty was to the Empire, to her people, to her family, and yet here she was finding herself drawn to a human who had no place in her world. But despite her best efforts, she couldn't pull away. Every time she tried to distance herself, the pull between them only grew stronger. One afternoon, as Elara was walking through the palace halls, she found herself face to face with her father, the Emperor, his stern expression as cold and unyielding as ever. Elara had always respected him, but in this moment she couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment, a reminder of everything she had been forced into, everything that had been taken from her. "I trust you are preparing yourself for the responsibilities ahead," her father said, his voice sharp with authority, but also laced with something else, a sense of expectation that she knew all too well. "Of course, father," she replied with a forced calm, her voice betraying none of the anger and confusion that bubbled beneath the surface. "Good," he said, nodding as though satisfied, "but I expect you to remember your place. You are marrying Marcus, not because you want to, but because the Empire needs this alliance. To not forget that, Elara." She nodded stiffly, though inside she was seething. How could he say that to her so casually, as if she were just a tool to be used for the Empire's gain? How could he speak of her marriage as if it were just another political deal when she felt like her entire world was being ripped apart? "I understand, father," she said, her voice low and controlled, but it felt like a lie. She wasn't sure if she believed it herself anymore. Her father studied her for a moment, as though searching for something in her eyes, something that would tell him whether she truly understood her duty or whether she was faltering. But he said nothing more, simply turned and walked away, leaving Elara standing in the hallway alone with the weight of his words pressing down on her. She spent the rest of the day in a haze, her mind occupied by the tension between her duty and her growing feelings for Marcus. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, saw the way he looked at her with such quiet intensity, as though he could see right through her walls and into the heart of her soul. It was maddening. How could she possibly reconcile her growing affection for him with the demands of her people, with the expectations of her family? How could she allow herself to feel something for a human who had no place in her world? That night, Marcus came to her chamber, as he often did now, though this time there was a quiet unease between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Elara could feel the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. She had never been good at confrontation, never been good at facing the truth of her feelings, but tonight she knew it was inevitable. Marcus stood at the doorway, his eyes searching hers with a quiet determination. "Elara, I need to know where you stand with this." "Where we stand," he said, his voice low but steady. She swallowed hard, her chest tight, with the fear of what was coming, of what she might say or do. But she knew she couldn't keep running from this anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't feeling the same things he was feeling. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do this, how to be what everyone expects me to be, and still feel what I feel for you." "You don't have to know everything right now," Marcus replied, his voice calm and understanding. "You just have to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not asking you to choose between us and your duty, but I can't pretend that what we have isn't real, and I don't want you to either. Elara closed her eyes at his words, her heart pounding in her chest. The conflict inside her was unbearable. She knew what her father expected of her, she knew what the Empire needed. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she could continue living a lie. She wasn't sure she could continue to ignore what was happening between her and Marcus, the way he made her feel, the way he saw her, in a way no one else ever had. When she opened her eyes again, she looked at him with a rawness that she had never shown before. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, "but I can't seem to stay away from you either." His hand reached out slowly as if waiting for her permission to close the distance between them, and for the first time Elara didn't pull away, she didn't resist. Instead, she allowed herself to take a step forward and meet him halfway, her heart racing as his fingers brushed against hers. And in that touch, everything shifted. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit what she had been avoiding. She wanted him, she needed him, in ways she couldn't explain. And as his hand found hers, Elara realized that this was no longer about duty or obligation. It was about something much deeper, something that would change everything for both of them. The days that followed were a storm of conflicting emotions. Elara found herself torn between the person she had always been and the person she was becoming. Marcus's presence in her life was no longer something she could ignore, no longer something she could control. Each time they spoke, each time their hands brushed, it felt like the world around her was shifting. And she didn't know how to stop it. She didn't know how to stop herself from feeling what she was feeling, from caring about him in a way that defied all logic. The pressure of her duty weighed heavily on her shoulders, but now there was a new burden, one she couldn't push aside, no matter how much she wanted to focus on her role as the future leader of the Valari Empire. She found herself constantly drawn to Marcus, his words, his touch, his quiet strength. It was all so foreign to her, so different from the world she had known. But it was also the one thing that made her feel alive in ways she hadn't experienced before, and that terrified her. She spent hours pacing her chambers at night, lost in her thoughts, her mind racing with the same questions over and over again. What would happen if she chose Marcus over her duty? What would the Empire think? What would her father say? The thought of defying her family, her people, felt like a betrayal. But the thought of walking away from Marcus felt like a part of herself would die. One evening she found herself standing on the balcony, overlooking the city, the lights of the palace glimmering in the distance, the vast expanse of the empire stretching out before her. She had always found solace in the quiet beauty of the view, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like she was on the edge of something far greater than herself. Marcus appeared at her side without warning, his presence as steady and grounding as ever. He didn't say anything at first, simply stood next to her in the silence of the night, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But the tension between them was palpable. She could feel it in the way he stood so close yet kept his distance, in the way his gaze lingered on her, as though waiting for her to speak first. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice quiet and uncertain. "I don't know what to do," she said, her words more vulnerable than she wanted them to be. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be what the Empire needs and be with you." Marcus turned to face her, his expression soft but unwavering. "I never asked you to choose between us and your duty, Elara," he said, his voice calm, but filled with a sincerity that cut through her confusion. "I know this is hard, and I know it's not what you expected, but I want you to know I'm not asking you to sacrifice yourself for me. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you whatever you choose." His words hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. They were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had been afraid to admit to herself. Marcus wasn't asking her to choose him over her empire. He was asking her to let him be part of her life, to be there for her when she needed him the most. And that was the one thing she had never allowed herself, to have someone who could stand with her, not because of her title, not because of her power, but because of who she was. She looked up at him, and their eyes meeting in the dim light of the balcony, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was being pulled in two directions. She didn't feel like she was torn between two worlds. She just felt the warmth of his presence, the steady comfort of knowing that whatever came next, she wouldn't have to face it alone. "I don't know what the future holds," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but I don't want to face it without you." Marcus's gaze softened, and for a moment he said nothing. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand. It is a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "I'm not going anywhere, Elara," he said softly. "I'm right here. No matter what happens, we'll figure this out together." In that moment, the weight of everything she had been carrying seemed to lessen just a little bit. The tension that had gripped her chest loosened, and for the first time in a long time, Elara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have both her duty and the love she had never expected to find. Maybe she could be the leader her people needed, and the person who stood beside Marcus. The future was still uncertain, and there was no telling what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, Elara didn't feel alone. She didn't feel lost in the chaos of her responsibilities and the weight of her heritage. She simply felt the quiet strength of Marcus's hand in hers and the promise that they would face whatever came together. The weeks that followed were filled with decisions. Elara knew she couldn't delay any longer. There were moments when she felt torn between her heart and her duty, but she had begun to realize that the two weren't always at odds. Sometimes they could coexist. Sometimes the path forward wasn't as clear-cut as she had always been told. Sometimes it wasn't about choosing one over the other, but about finding a way to make both work. She spent her days in meetings with her council, with her advisors and generals, each of them eager to discuss the future of the Valari Empire, each of them unaware of the quiet rebellion growing within her heart. Elara had always been the heir, the one groomed for greatness, the one expected to take the empire into a new age. But now she saw the cracks in the system, the way her people's future was being shaped by a singular vision of power and control, one that didn't always serve them. It wasn't just about conquest anymore. It was about balance and compassion, something she hadn't been taught to value, but something she could no longer ignore. At night, Marcus remained by her side, more often than not, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet conversation, but always offering his unwavering support. Elara had found comfort in his presence, in the way he understood her, in a way no one else ever had. He didn't expect her to be perfect or to have all the answers. He simply stood beside her and let her make her own choices, even when she wasn't sure of what they would mean for her empire or for them. One evening, as they walked through the gardens together, Elara felt the weight of the decision she knew was coming. She had been avoiding it for days, avoiding the truth of what she needed to do. But now it was unavoidable. She could no longer put it off. "I need to speak with my father," she said quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of her words. "I need to tell him everything." Marcus nodded without hesitation. "I'll be here for you, whatever happens," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. And Elara knew in that moment that no matter what she chose, he would stand beside her. He would never let her face this alone. The next morning, Elara stood before the Emperor, her father's throne looming above her. She had never felt more out of place in his presence than she did now. She had always respected him, but now the distance between them felt vast. It felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to make a choice that would change everything. "Father," she began, her voice steady, but with a tremor that betrayed her nerves, "I need to talk to you about the future of the Empire." The Emperor regarded her silently, his gaze piercing, as though he was searching for something beneath her words, his hands resting on the armrests of his throne, as though he were waiting for her to say something that would reveal her true intentions. "What is it, Elara?" he said finally, his voice colder than she remembered. "I'm not going to marry Marcus for political gain," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "I'm not going to be a pawn in some game of power. I need to make my own choices, and I need to lead in a way that serves the people, not just the legacy of the Valari Empire." The silence that followed was deafening. Elara held her breath, waiting for her father's response, but he said nothing at first, simply staring at her as though he couldn't quite process what she had just said. "You would defy me, you would defy everything I've worked for," he finally said, his voice low and filled with disbelief. Elara stood tall despite the weight of his words. She didn't look away from him. She couldn't look away now. "I'm not defying you, father. I'm simply choosing a different path, one where I can be true to myself and to my people." The Emperor's expression hardened, but Elara didn't flinch. She knew this would not be easy. She knew the cost of defying him. But she also knew that she couldn't live in a world where she ignored her heart. She couldn't live a life bound by expectations that suffocated her spirit. For a long moment, her father said nothing, but then his voice broke the silence with a finality that chilled her. "I'll give you one chance, Elara, one chance to prove that your decisions will not destroy everything we've built." Elara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was just the beginning, that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But for the first time, she felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She wasn't just a political pawn. She was a leader who would make her own decisions, a leader who would fight for her people and the future she believed in. As she left the throne room, she felt Marcus's presence beside her, and for the first time she didn't feel lost, she didn't feel torn between two worlds. She simply felt the strength of their bond, the promise that no matter what happened, she wouldn't have to face it alone. And that was enough for now.